Welcome to our annual CAPE workshop for the academic year 2020-2021. This is the seventh year that we've been hosting the workshop, but it is the very first time that we are doing it virtually. Of course, the dynamics will be different. We do not have the luxury of sharing the same physical space or experiencing that warmth that comes with face-to-face interaction. And I know that students looked forward to a day away from your schools when you could also visit a university that many of you hope to soon attend. So, yes, this year's workshop is different. This new online presentation is definitely different. But if you really consider it, these normal circumstances that we are accustomed to are peripheral to the objectives of the workshop, which are to provide assistance to students studying for the CSEC examinations. This year's workshop represents our new normal, and maybe the COVID-19 pandemic has pushed us into a direction that was inevitable, and dare I say, possibly even more practical and efficient. In keeping with the restrictions mandated by the COVID-19 pandemic, our presentations have been pre-recorded and have been posted on the History Department's YouTube channel. There are half-hour sessions on topics selected from your syllabus. You can post your questions in the link provided, and you can rest assured that your questions will be answered. When we really consider this new scenario, it does provide you with one huge advantage. You can revisit the presentations as many times as you wish. We in the Department of History continue to be very aware of our role as keepers and disseminators of knowledge of the past. And as we have done before, we are and will continue to take all the necessary measures to ensure that we fulfill this responsibility of keeping the discipline of history alive and applicable to the present and the future. Additionally, our penultimate goal is the molding of young and not so young minds towards the creation and fostering of informed, well-grounded, and well-rounded adults who can make positive and valid contributions to the development of self, nation, and region. Pandemic or whatever other hurdles may come our way, we will not be deterred from achieving both these goals. I must remind you that history is way more than just about writing and passing exams. It provides you with the tools with which and the foundation on which empires have been built. Let us be the architects of our society, taking it into the future on the back of its history. Also, you are now part of our country's history, where, for the very first time, we are experiencing a pandemic in such pervasive and almost debilitating manner. You are also part of the UWI's history, since for the very first time, teaching and learning are being done virtually. As has been done throughout our region's history, students must rise to the current challenge and let it not debilitate you or deter you from excelling in your studies. Our online presentations are geared towards assisting you to achieve this excellence. So students, engage our new virtual forum. Visit the presentations as many times as you wish. Post whatever questions you may have. Appreciate the richness and relevance of our history and be inspired to further your study of history in your tertiary level studies, hopefully at the UWI. On that note, let me once again welcome you to our virtual CAPE workshop. Hello everyone, I am Dr. Sharian Singh and I will be presenting to you today on the topic of Mahatma Gandhi, Jawaharlal Nehru and the Indian national movement. Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi, or Mahatma Gandhi as he is popularly known, was born in 1869 in India. He was the son of a diwan or minister, and that placed Gandhi in a home that was very influential. Gandhi studied law in London and returned to India in 1891. Soon afterwards, he was commissioned to South Africa as a lawyer for service for 1 year. However, Gandhi ended up staying in South Africa for over 21 years. It was in South Africa for the very first time in his life that Mahatma Gandhi encountered racism in any form. In fact, as soon as Gandhi arrived in South Africa and attempted to board the train, he was thrown out. Because he could actually afford it, Gandhi had purchased a first class ticket on the train, but they did not allow him on the train simply because he was Indian. It was only because a particular South African passenger, argued Gandhi's case that he was allowed on the train. When he went to the hotels, even he was told that they were all booked up again simply because he was Indian. So for the first time, Gandhi was experiencing racism in his life. Um, as I said, Gandhi was supposed to just spend 1 year in South Africa. However, while there, he encountered the Indian indentured laborers who had been in South Africa from about 1860. They were enduring a lot of trials and tribulations and struggles because of the atrocities of the system of Indian indenture. So during that year, Gandhi took up their cause. He fought for them in many different ways. He signed petitions, he argued their cases, he encouraged the Indian indentured laborers to stand up for their rights and so forth. However, Gandhi, after his 1 year had been terminated, he decided to stay in South Africa and take up the cause of the Indian indentured laborers long term. And as you can see in the slide, it actually shows a photograph of Gandhi being thrown off the train. Now, South Africa turned out during that 21 years to be the space in which Gandhi was able to create and to test and to develop many of the methods that he would eventually use in the Indian national movement in India. These methods collectively went on to be termed the Gandhian method. And so we can say that South Africa proved to be the space where a blueprint of sorts of the Gandhian method was implemented. Now, this 21-year experiment, so to speak, in South Africa really prepared Gandhi for the Indian situation. He developed a style of politics, his own style of leadership. He developed many techniques that would be implemented in India in their fight against British rule. He was able to develop a successful, non-violent, civil disobedience-oriented strategy that was known as Satyagraha, which we will talk about a bit later on. He developed faith in the capacity of the masses, in the ability of the masses to fight for themselves. He developed various strategies in leading different religions, in leading different regions, and in leading different social classes. Gandhi was also able to engage women in his fight against the atrocities of indentureship in South Africa. And this attitudes towards women would also be extended to the Indian national movement in India. And he was also able to deal with or learn how to deal with facing the wrath of his own followers, because there are many instances where Gandhi's followers did not agree with his principles or his methods, and they eventually sometimes turned on him in a rather negative way. So he learned, to do that also. So basically, South Africa proved to be the space within which Gandhi was able to develop his philosophies and principles, which he would go on to apply to the Indian context. Now, Gandhi returned to India after 21 years in South Africa. And for the first 5 years or so, he did not join the movement that was already bubbling. He just traveled throughout India to get a feel of what was going on. We're going to look now at some of the main principles of Gandhi that he developed in South Africa and would go on to apply in the Indian context. Now, the overriding principle of the Indian national movement that was applied and developed by Gandhi is known as Satyagraha. Satyagraha comprises two words. Satya means truth, and agraha means a persistence or a holding firm to this truth. So put together, Satyagraha refers to a persistent or never-ending search or adherence to the truth. Satyagraha was a passive resistance strategy, a strategy of civil disobedience that did not condone violence in any form. It was a principle based on nonviolence. Within Satyagraha, you had the idea of never giving up. It entailed action on a physical plane, yes, but it also included a moral stance. It included an attitude of the mind, a firmness, a resolve. Okay, Satyagraha also defended just causes. It was one based on love, yes, so you did not engage any kind of violence, but rather non-violent sacrifice. And there are many strategies of non-violent sacrifice that would be implemented, but we'll look at those a little bit later on. It was a strategy based not in violence, but in love, but also fearlessness. So it wasn't a meek love that just gave in to anything. It was one based on fearlessness. And of course, the idea of no submission to injustice. Interestingly, Satyagraha also took with it the element of faith in God, in whatever way you might represent the idea of the divine, but a faith in God. However, Gandhi's idea of a faith in God simply did not reside, or did not reside, in fact, in rituals and personal prayer and so forth. His idea of faith in God was seen through the lens of you can see God in every man or woman and woman. Okay, so Satyagraha was this overriding ideology throughout the Indian national movement, and it essentially meant a persistent, unrelenting search for the truth, one that was based in love, fearlessness, non-violence, and justice. Another main principle of Gandhi was the idea of non-violence, and the term for that, a Hindi term for that, is ahimsa. It was a method that Gandhi used in achieving satyagraha, no violence at all, because the philosophy, and this philosophy was based in the idea that the British government in India at that time was so powerful. You could not fight them arm for arms or arms for arms, okay? So Gandhi's idea was you needed to fight them using non-violent method, and that Gandhi had this unmoved faith in this non-violence, so much so that whenever, and this just happened about 2 or 3 times, whenever his followers would resort to violence, Gandhi would bring the movement to a screeching halt. Okay, so strong was his faith in non-violence. A third principle was that of Sarvodaya. Sarvodaya means service to all people. Gandhi believed in equality of all people, and this Sarvodaya was based on that idea. And again, he tied it to a spiritual element, and we have to remember that non-violence, ahimsa, and satyagraha and Sarvodaya, they all carried with them a deep spiritual element. I'm not saying religious, I'm saying spiritual element. So there is the idea that, you know, service to all people, not just to yourself. In Hinduism, there is the principle of moksha, where the ultimate goal of life is release from the cycle of birth and death. But Gandhi took this idea and applied it to the Indian national movement, but it wasn't a selfish sort of focus. The idea of Sarvodaya was that you can acquire this moksha by serving people, not simply by doing your own personal prayers and rituals and so forth. So service to people can also acquire this moksha. So it was Sarvodaya, or service to people, was seen from a very elevated platform, so to speak. Yeah. So Gandhi reconciled the idea of self-realization with service to society, and it was a principle that was very strongly held and promoted by Gandhi. A fourth major principle pertained to women. Gandhi was of the very strong opinion that women should be treated in a manner that was equal to the treatment received by men, and that women had the right to shape their own destiny. Ahimsa, the idea of non-violence, also ruled out any kind of suppression of women, any kind of violence, not just physical violence, but emotional violence, any form of violence. He promoted the idea that there should be change in any of the traditions or laws and regulations that would place women at a disadvantage. So he promoted changes in traditions and the legal status of women. He argued for the education of women. He argued for the general upliftment of women. And women, because of this attitude of Gandhi, went on to play an increasingly huge role in the Indian national movement. As the movement progressed, the number of women, and not simply middle-class women at the helm of the Indian national movement, but the number of women in the masses also grew immensely. Gandhi, at the end of the day, he promoted the idea and he did say that, I have brought the women out of the kitchen. It is your duty now to see that they don't go back there. Another main idea of Gandhi was that of untouchability. Now, untouchability, this issue, referred to a group of individuals at the bottom of the social ladder in India as per the Indian caste system, who were termed untouchables. And this idea of untouchability or the untouchables was based on the belief that these people were impure, both physically and spiritually. So if you look at the screen, you would see that, that quote of Gandhi saying, "My fight against untouchability is a fight against the impure in humanity." So, his suggestion is that the impurity is not in the people, that group of people. The impurity was in the people's perception of that group of people. So Gandhi fought against untouchability because at the end of the day, he was fighting for social equality. He tried to instill in this group of individuals self-confidence of all in all depressed classes. And this was based on the idea of equality and, of course, the unity of all life. He even went as far as terming this group of people who were previously known as untouchables as Harijan. And Harijan literally means children of God. Another of Gandhi's main principles was that of Swadeshi. Literally, Swadeshi means belonging to or made in one's own country. So what Gandhi was promoting was that Indians were to buy locally, whether locally made cloth, locally made goods, artifacts, pottery, or even food. They were to ensure that they would purchase only locally made goods. But on a deeper level, Swadeshi means a sort of service to one's country of birth. It was a sense of patriotism, but it was a deeper sense, an all-sided patriotism, carrying with it a spiritual element. And this idea of Swadeshi definitely permeates Gandhi's whole philosophy and efforts. The idea of Swaraj or self-rule was connected to the idea of Swadeshi. And Swadeshi also would promote the indigenous ideals and institutions, such as the cotton industry that the British had destroyed when they came into India, and all the small industries that had all been destroyed by the British economic policies. Swadeshi also carried with it the idea of self-sacrifice for community sacrifice of district, for district sacrifice of province, and province sacrifice of nation. So Swadeshi was another one of Gandhi's main principles. Khadi was also another main principle of Gandhi. If you look at the picture there, you see Gandhi spinning. He was spinning on spinning cotton. Khadi literally refers to hand-spun or hand-woven cloth. It's a rough kind of cotton. And so Gandhi was promoting the idea that Indians needed to be self-sufficient, self-reliant. So one of the ways that they could do this is by producing their own clothes or cloth. Okay, so Gandhi himself, he promoted this principle by practicing it, because every single day Gandhi would sit and spin cotton for a period of time, every single day. Even if he traveled, he would take his spinning wheel with him and he would ensure that he would be spinning. So he saw Khadi as a way of, yes, making our own clothes, but also as a way of removing Indians from abject poverty. He saw it also as being applicable to the masses, to the semi-staff, because they all had access to spinning wheels and could spin their own cloth. And of course, khadi was a larger symbol of revival of the handicraft and cottage industries that had been destroyed by British economic policies. Another main ideas that Gandhi promoted, and in fact was an activity more so, was that of fasting or going on hunger strikes. And Gandhi definitely went on a number of these hunger strikes whenever he felt that the situation was serious or grave enough to warrant it. So there were times when, the British were being extremely unfair, extremely ruthless, and Gandhi would decide that it is time to go on a strike. During the Quit India movement, he also went on a hunger strike. Now, the British, they did not want Gandhi's death on their hands, because over time, Gandhi was becoming renowned internationally, not just in India. So, the British definitely didn't want him to die. So most of the times, Gandhi's hunger strikes definitely would bear fruit in one way or the other. Then strikes or hartals were definitely promoted by Gandhi as another of his main philosophies. And it was rooted in this idea of non-violence also. So basically, you would not do anything, you would go on a strike. If you were working in an industry or a company, you would not work. Strikes also would take the forms of shutting down of private businesses, also of not going to work if you worked in the government services. So basically showing your discontent by not engaging in any activities that would support the government, even if it meant shutting down your own private business. And here in the image, you have a very large-scale strike against the Rowlatt Bills, which was one of the beginning of Gandhi's engagement with the Indian national movement. And of course, these strikes would grow in numbers as the Indian national movement grew. So if you look at these principles collectively, they functioned to see, progress in the Indian national movement. And of course, these principles together would eventually realize the acquisition of independence for India. And they were the driving force behind all of the phases of the independence struggle. So in all of the phases, such as the Rowlatt Act period, the non-cooperation movement, the civil disobedience movement, the Quit India movement, and of course, then the acquisition of independence, those principles work together to bring the British Empire to their knees, because they incorporated non-violence, non-cooperation, civil disobedience, and satyagraha, all principles that the British were not accustomed to dealing with. These principles were based on non-violence. So of course, if the British use their full force of violence, then that would not reflect well on them. So collectively, Gandhi's major principles and beliefs were very successful in acquiring independence for India. Now we'll very briefly look at some of the main phases of the Indian national movement. Gandhi initiated his activities with the movement with what was known as the Rowlatt Act. Now, the Defense of India Act was passed in 1915, and that was during the World War I period. And that act, basically, it passed repressive wartime provisions. What the Rowlatt Act in 1919 was attempting to do was to make those wartime provisions permanent. So basically, it was trying to allow for certain political cases to be tried without juries, and of course, arrest and intern individuals without a trial. Gandhi, he thought that this Rowlatt Act was totally unfair, and along with the Indian national movement and members of the Indian National Congress, he called on people to disobey these laws, and he launched a movement to have these laws repealed. And this was the first time, as I said, that Gandhi engaged in large-scale activities with the Indian national movements. So in response to Gandhi's calls, you had a number of rallies taking place, a number of large-scale but peaceful marches. And everything was going, as they would want it to be, until a certain incident occurred in Amritsar. It is known as the Jallianwala Bagh massacre. That incident was a turning point where Indians would now move from being moderate and patient and loyal supporters of the British Raj to nationalists who could never again place their trust in the idea of British fair play. Okay, in a nutshell, what happened is that a certain group of individuals, about 10,000 of them or so, they were celebrating a festival known as Baisakhi. And they had come together. Jallianwala Bagh is like a park, but it was enclosed all around by walls, and there was only one narrow entry or exit way. So these individuals, they weren't supposed to congregate as per the Rowlatt Act. But in their minds, they were not congregating for political purpose. They were congregating to celebrate a festival. And then the British, led by General Dyer, they simply went into that park and they started firing on the Indians. Over 500 were dead and hundreds more were wounded. So that was the catalyst for it was the first nationwide the protest, and it was a catalyst for the transformation of the Indian national movement to a larger scale, more nationalist in their outlook and perception. So the Rowlatt Act and the opposition against the act led to this large-scale movement known as the non-cooperation movement, which was initiated in 1920. So the non-cooperation movement was what we can call the first nationwide satyagraha, or large-scale civil disobedience. From that point, Indians were now asking for self-government. Prior to 1920, they simply wanted adjustments made. There was the idea of Swaraj or self-rule, but it wasn't being promoted, very vehemently. So it was from 1920 that the idea of self-government was brought to the fore. Of course, as per Gandhi's principles, there was to be no violence, okay? No violent activities. Individuals were supposed to display their disapproval by renouncing whatever titles they would have gotten from the British government. Nobody was being forced to engage in any activities. If you engage in any of these activities, you were to do it voluntarily. But people were called on to boycott courthouses. They were called on to boycott government services, boycott foreign goods, boycott any kind of elections. And students also were called on to boycott government educational institutions. That'll be tertiary level institutions. Individuals were also called on to not pay their taxes, so boycott payment of taxes. So collectively, when you look at it all around, and people definitely started to heed the call of Gandhi for this large-scale boycott, the government was being shaken by this united Indian front, which was happening for the very first time. This mass support was happening for the very first time. So the non-cooperation movement can be seen as a very first phase where, Indians on a mass level were coming together to face the British. In fact, it also marked the transition from the idea of Indian nationalism from a middle-class sort of orientation to one carrying with it a mass basis. The masses were now being called on to follow, which was not happening before, okay? During the non-cooperation movement phase also, the Indian national movement, they got the support of the Muslims, which was not always the case throughout the larger movement. However, unfortunately, in 1922, the non-cooperation movement was called off, even though it was gaining momentum because of one violent outbreak in a particular location. As soon as that violence broke out, Gandhi simply called off the non-cooperation movement because he was very firm in the belief that whatever the Indians do against the British government, there should be no violence. After the non-cooperation movement was called off, throughout the entire Indian national movement, there were periods of ebbs and flows. So you would have those periods where a lot of activity would be taking place and a lot of momentum would be gathered again. The non-cooperation movement was one, and this was followed 8 years later by the movement known as the civil disobedience movement. Now, this movement, or this phase in the Indian national movement, it was uh, um, it was created by something known as the Salt Satyagraha, or the Salt March. Now, the British government in India, they had a monopoly on salt production. They did not want Indians to produce salt, even though it could be so easily done. So there was this monopoly on salt production. And there was also a tax set. There was a tax known as the salt tax. So eventually Gandhi, he found this was so unfair that, Indians, when the salt is there readily available, they could not produce salt, and they also had to deal with the salt tax. So to show their opposition to this idea of a salt tax and the British monopoly on salt, Gandhi initiated a march from his ashram in Gujarat to a coastal village known as Dundee. The march was begun on the 12th of March, and it ended. So from the ashram in Gujarat, they left on the 12th of March, and they got to Dundee, which was 240 miles away, on April 6th. When Gandhi got to Dundee, he picked up a handful of salt. It was a coastal village, so it was on the beach, as you would say. He picked up a handful of salt and declared the beginning of the civil disobedience movement. Of course, 1 month afterwards, Gandhi was arrested on the 5th of May. But nevertheless, even though Gandhi was in jail, Indians continued to break salt laws throughout India for 2 months. Breaking salt laws simply meant they started producing salt, even though it was against the law. Okay, during the civil disobedience movement, support grew, and especially so from the masses and from women. Women were very much at the fore of the civil disobedience movement, because as per one of Gandhi's policies that we looked at, he was totally in favor of bringing Indians out of the kitchen, as he said, and have them take part in all aspects of Indian life, the Indian national movement included. So during the phase of the civil disobedience, more than 66,000 people were arrested, Gandhi and Nehru included. However, again, the British, they are very wary of what's going on, getting to the point of being alarmed. And discussions took place between Gandhi and an individual known as Irwin. And this led to the what was known as the Pact, the Gandhi-Irwin Pact of March 1931. Certain conditions were outlined by both Gandhi and the British. And at the end of it all, the Gandhi-Irwin Pact was signed and agreed upon. Gandhi called off the civil disobedience movement. He was released from jail, and Indians were permitted to produce salt. So the civil disobedience movement gives us an idea of how successful Gandhi's philosophies and ideas and beliefs could have been. It was one of the very successful phases of the Indian national movement. Another main phase was throughout the 1930s. Now, during this period, activity was going on, but of a different nature. During the 1930s, the Indian National Congress, they decided to engage in what we can call an alternative strategy, not simply fighting the British from the outside, but fighting them from within the government. So they started to partially cooperate with certain political reforms being instituted by the British. And then by the Government of India Act that was passed in 1935, Congress ministries were formed, so that the Congress were now inside government, so to speak. So they were fighting from both the inside and the outside. Via this Government of India Act of 1935, it claimed that a federation could be formed if 50% of the Indian states joined. But that didn't happen because they didn't get agreement from 50% of the Indian states. The right to vote was increased, but it was increased to just 14% of the population. As I said, Congress ministries were formed and provincial autonomy was promoted, where these Congress ministries basically had a lot of autonomy to make decisions and so forth pertaining to their various provinces. However, it was also during the 1930s that the British promoted even more. They were doing it before, but they promoted even more communal representation via separate electorates for depressed classes, for women, labor workers. Okay, now we can argue on the one hand, it seems fair enough that these depressed classes comprising the lower castes, as we would say, women, labor workers, they were given, care was taken to give them certain benefits or certain special treatment to allow that they got their representation. However, this would be the beginning of a larger monster known as separatism. It would be this idea of communal representation and separatism would also feed into the growing notion of a separate state for Muslims, which of course eventually led to the partition of India into India and Pakistan. But the monster that was created was not really the notion of separatism, it was the violence that this would engage, where millions, at the end of the day, when India was partitioned, millions of people would be hurt, would be injured, and between 1 million to 2 million people actually lost their lives. The numbers are still they're not definite, but at least 1 million people died in this transition, from India to India and Pakistan. So during the 1930s, we also saw the rise of communalism and the growth of the Muslim League in India. Another major phase was what was called the Quit India movement, or Bharat Choro. It literally means quit India. This would emerged during the mounting pressures of World War II. And the British needed, there was a lot going on for the British, a lot on their plate. They needed to resolve the question of India's future, because it would have been a number of decades where they had to continuously be facing the Indian national movement, the various phases of the movement, the civil disobedience movement, the non-cooperation movement, which was growing and growing, as time went along and with each phase. So it was really eating away at British control of India. So along with the pressures of World War II, they needed to resolve India's future, the question of India's future. The British also wanted Indian support. They wanted the Indian troops to fight in World War II, to engage, to support them in World War II. However, at this point, the Indians said, of course, the Indian national movement, we will only support the British in this World War effort if we were to be granted complete independence at the end of the World War period. Okay, so, and they stood firm this time, because the Indians did support the British in the World War I effort. But now they were standing firm. They were not supporting unless they would be granted total independence. So in 1942, a mission known as the Cripps mission was set up. And at the end of discussions, they still did not offer Indians immediate and total self-rule, which was what the Indians wanted. At that point, Gandhi said, no, they are not accepting what the Cripps mission was offering. And he launched the Quit India movement. And that was the phase of the movement, basically do or die. We are going to do whatever it takes at this point, still within the realm of nonviolence, but we are not going to concede to anything less than immediate and total self-rule. The entire Indian National Congress they were jailed until the end of World War II. The British did not wait this time for the momentum to build. They jailed the entire Indian National Congress leadership, Gandhi and Nehru also. Nevertheless, the movement continued. Okay, so it was leave India, basically quit India. One difference of this particular phase of the movement was that there were incidents of violence that Gandhi did condone. He didn't encourage it, but it broke out. And at that point, Gandhi said the British were engaging in so many different types of violence against India. This time, he's not going to tell them to stop. Okay, so this was one of the biggest differences of this phase of the Indian national movement, where violence did happen and Gandhi didn't stop it. So the Quit India movement, eventually after the World War II period, it did see India, acquiring independence, because after World War II, there was economic devastation in India, of course, and throughout the British Empire. In India, there was escalating communal violence because the British were so concerned with their war efforts that they were not paying attention to what was happening in India. They had already planted the seed and had watered the seedling of separatism, of communalism. And now that eventually escalated into violence because it was it was unchecked. They were not concerned at that point. Finally, after World War II, the British realized that they needed to leave India, grant India independence. So in 1945, independence was originally set for June 1948. But of course, again, in setting out the conditions in 1945, they were presenting this idea of a loose federation between both in the Indian National Congress and the Muslim League rejected it, okay? Because whereas the Indian National Congress didn't want India to be separated, the Muslim League was adamant. They wanted a separate state known as Pakistan. So there was no agreement. And of course, you had, more communal violence breaking out, more bloodshed, so that the British realized they had lost control of the situation. And they did something very drastic. This was in June 1947. They employed a new Viceroy Mountbatten, and they sent him to India to deal with the issue of partition and independence. So on June 3rd, 1947, Viceroy Mountbatten set a new date for Indian independence, which was 15th of August, 1947. You had a little more than 2 months to deal with this entire process of independence and partition. That was nowhere sufficient for this very complex process. But the British didn't care at that point. Their concern was to get out of India and basically leave the Indians to fend for themselves, to figure it out. So they had come into India for a number of centuries, created havoc, destroyed Indians' economy, destroyed India's society. And now, because they had lost control of the situation, they were simply going to leave India and leave the Indians to deal with the problem of independence and partition. And problems would have been numerous, as I said, because there were no systems and structures put in place to deal with independence and partition especially. Lives were lost, chaos ensued. Many people lost their lives. As I said, more than 1 million people lost their lives. But nevertheless, on the 15th of August, 1947, India acquired independence and Pakistan was created. And if you look at the map here, you would see what India would look like from the 15th of August, 1947. You have India in the green area. So the body of it would be India. And then you have Pakistan on the eastern side and Pakistan on the eastern side near to Calcutta, and then West Pakistan near to Delhi. Today, of course, East Pakistan is now Bangladesh, and Pakistan just comprises what was initially West Pakistan. We look a little bit now at an individual who became the first Prime Minister of India, Jawaharlal Nehru. Nehru was born a lawyer to a family of Kashmiri Brahmins, and he developed a very keen interest in Indian politics from very early on. In fact, his father was a member of the Indian National Congress. Very quickly, he became impressed by Gandhi's philosophy. In fact, he was mentored by Gandhi. But while he was very enamored of many of Gandhi's philosophies and principles, he developed eventually his own ideas of how freedom was to be attained, of how freedom should be. There are many times that he did not agree with Gandhi on certain principles or ideas. But, throughout the national movement, while Gandhi was present, he was the one, Gandhi was the one who seemed to overshadow Nehru and be at the fore. Nehru was associated with the Congress Party from as early as 1919. That was around the time that Gandhi also entered. And he very quickly solidified his resolve to win India's independence. He was all for the idea of a total self-rule, not for partial grants or concessions being made by the British, which was what was happening until 1920. Throughout his career in the Indian national movement, Nehru was jailed a number of times for a total of at least 9 years. He was the president of the Congress Party on multiple occasions and for multiple times. He promoted a goal of complete independence from Britain, as opposed, as I said, to dominion status. And he seemed to be, from very early on, the natural successor, so to speak, to Gandhi. Now, his sense of nationalism, as I said, he was an admirer of Gandhi, of his principles, but he eventually developed his own sense of nationalism that was a bit different. He believed in a politically free nation, but also one that was economically free, one that could support itself, okay? He believed that Indian nationalism cannot be built on the basis of religion, caste, or community, but on secularism. And this was a little bit different from many of the arms or the individuals in the Indian national movement or the Indian National Congress. They weren't really concerned about changing this phase of society at that point. But from very early on, Nehru's emphasis was on secularism. His nationalism was also infused with the spirit of internationalism. Okay, he was an ardent supporter of internationalism. He made the Indian National Congress broaden its outlook to take more interest in international affairs. So he didn't just want them to be internal looking. He said, yes, we are in the process of fighting for independence, but we need to connect our struggles for independence and to see it as part of a global struggle, because at that time, India was not the only country fighting for independence from the British. So he made the Congress realize that this Indian struggle for freedom was actually part of a global struggle, and that they should draw strength from that and liaise with these other countries, you know, so that they can compare notes, as we would say, and maybe that will make the process easier. Maybe your strategies would change a bit. But he was totally in favor of this idea of internationalism. He went on to forge links with global independence movements, and he also sought foreign allies for India. So he made a lot of effort and he engaged in a lot of activities on his own to bring this sense of internationalism into the growing Indian nationalism. And here we have an image of showing Gandhi at the Congress of Oppressed Nationalities held in Brussels in February 1927. So he made all different kinds of efforts to infuse the growing sense of Indian nationalism with a larger sense of internationalism. So Nehru, as I said, became the first Prime Minister of independent India. Gandhi died the following year. He was assassinated the following year. And one can argue that Nehru really started to shine as a leader when he became Prime Minister, because prior to that, his presence in the Indian national movement, in my opinion, it was largely overshadowed by the presence of Gandhi, which is not a negative thing, because at the end of the day, Gandhi's philosophies and his ideas and his strategies work together to actually take India into independence, work together to acquire independence for the Indian subcontinent, albeit in a partition state of India and Pakistan. So this brings me to the end of my presentation today. I trust that the information was beneficial, that you can now have a deeper insight into the individuals known as Mahatma Gandhi, Jawaharlal Nehru, and the workings of the Indian national movement that eventually was able to realize independence for India from British rule that had been in place for a number of protracted decades and centuries. Thank you.